I have some questions that I want you to ask you to make you think. But before I ask these, we need to review for a few minutes. It's always good to review. And specifically reviewing on why is God sovereign? Well, it's because God is creator. That's why. I mean, He is the one that the Bible tells you in Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And then what follows in the rest of the verses is God on each day making what He did and telling you what order He made those. And then also God made man too on His day. On the sixth day, God created man in His own image. In the image of God He created him, male and female. He created them, Genesis 1:27. So why is God sovereign? He is the creator. But not only is He the creator, He is God and God alone. There is none like Him. He's not the creator among many gods. He's not the supreme God over a bunch of gods. He is the only God. There is none like Him. He's the only one. Deuteronomy 4:35, to you it was shown that you might know that the Lord, He is God. There is no other, what? What does that verse say? Besides Him. And so what does it mean for God to be sovereign? He has the right to be sovereign because He is God and God alone, and He's the creator. And so that is His right. It is His right to be that. And then also, what it means is for Him to be sovereign is, as Wayne Grudem writes, God exercised a power over His creation is called God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty is His exercise of rule over His creation. Arthur Pink writes this about the sovereignty of God. We mean the supremacy of God, the kingship of God, the godhood of God. To say that God is sovereign is to declare that God is God. To say that God is sovereign is to declare that He is the Most High, doing according to His will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, so that none could stop His hand or say unto Him, what are you doing? No one can say, why are you doing this? Or what right you have to do this? To say that God is sovereign is to declare that He is the Almighty, the possessor of all power in heaven and earth, so that none could defeat His counsels, thwart His will. To say that God is sovereign is to declare that He is the governor among the nations, setting up kingdoms, overthrowing empires, and determining the course of dynasties as pleases Him best. To say that God is sovereign is to declare that He is the only ruler, the King of kings and Lord of lords. Such is the God of the Bible. And that what Arthur Pink says and what Wayne Grudem says is not their own opinion. It's taken from Scripture, especially Isaiah 46, 9 through 10. Remember the former things long past. For I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is no one like me, declaring the beginning, the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things which have not been done, saying, my purpose will be established, and I will accomplish all my good pleasure. Not some of my good pleasure, not hoping I can do what I want, or doing my good pleasure, but I will accomplish all my good pleasure. And so God is sovereign. He has that right to be sovereign, and it's His exercise of rule over creation. He has that right, and He does what He pleases because He is not some tyrant that is evil and wicked, and we have to be fearful. What is He going to do next? No, He is good, gracious, merciful, wise, all-knowing. Just a few of those attributes that we know of who He is. Because He is the Creator, because He is God alone, He's made everything for His glory and honor as well. And so He has that right. But He does what is always good and always best. Revelation 4:11, worthy are you, our Lord and our God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and because of your will they existed and were created. It's because of God's will they existed. It wasn't because of some random act over billions of years. God created everything exactly as He wanted. He reigns and rules. And so God is sovereign. And this is what it means for Him to be sovereign. And He reigns over His universe, and even inanimate objects obey Him, as I said last week. In Genesis 1:3, then God said, let there be light, and there was light. God created the light out of nothing, and there was light. And that light is just one example. You know that Jesus calmed the storm. The winds and the waves obeyed Him. The sun stood still when Joshua prayed and God stopped the sun. There's a few things of inanimate objects that they're not living and breathing as a person is, or even as an animal. God is sovereign even over His animal creation. The animal kingdom obeys Him. He caused a donkey to speak and rebuke the madness of Balaam, the prophet, who was hired to curse Israel. A whale obeyed God. The sea creature swallowed up Jonah, I should say. We traditionally think of a whale, but because that's one of the biggest living creatures that we know of that would today. Wicked men thought that they were able to get rid of Daniel by throwing him in a lion's den to be eaten alive. But God overthrown their plans. Daniel 6:22. My God sent His angel to shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, insomuch as I was found innocent before Him, and also toward you, O King, I have committed no crime. God is the one that controlled their mouths and their paws. And He showed His sovereignty over that when the king punished those who had tricked him. And immediately those mouths and those paws were allowed to do what is natural to the lion. And so God, we see, is sovereign over inanimate objects, the sun, the moon, the stars, the winds and the waves, and all these things obey Him. Even animals obey Him. But what about man? Is God sovereign over man? Whether it's a believer or an unbeliever, is God sovereign over man? Consider this. Does this mean that in God's sovereignty that man becomes a robot? That where man could do nothing but that everything he does, and he doesn't think for himself or do anything. Is man a robot, and then therefore not responsible for his actions? That nothing that man devises in his heart, even sinful sin, is his responsibility and his fault because he's just a robot? Or on the other side, is man too sinful for God to control and to be sovereign over? Those are some things to ponder about as we look on how God is sovereign over man, even sinful man. Arthur Pink writes this: alternatives confront us, and between them we are obliged to choose. Either God governs or is He governed. Either God rules or He is ruled. Either God has His way or man has theirs. Acts 17:28 tells you, for in Him we live and move and exist, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are also His children. You know, it's not just believers that owe their existence to God, but really all of mankind owes their existence to God. We owe the existence, we even owe the very breath in our lungs to God, to Him. It is God that we owe the very continuing of our own lives, the breath of our lungs, the continuing of our lives there. It is God that we owe every day to, allowing us even to make each and every decision. He gives us freedom. But I want you to know that God is the one that's in control of the outcome of those decisions. And that was what Paul was speaking of. Matthew Henry writes this, "It is not only owing to his patience and pity that our forfeited lives are not cut off, but it is owing to his power and goodness and fatherly care that our frail lives are prolonged. There needs not a positive act of his wrath to destroy us if he suspends the positive acts of his goodness. We die of ourselves." It's not just his wrath, but if he withheld his goodness. And so it's God's in control. I want to establish that man is not a robot. God gives freedom to make decisions. And man is going to be responsible for his sins. But God allows freedom in making decisions, but it's God who allows those decisions to be made. God is the one that, I should say, establishes those plans, whether they come to fruition or not. Even the words that we speak, God has the final decision on what is even said. Look here and see who is in control. Belshazzar, who was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, became proud and prideful. If you remember what happens with him, is he decides to take the furniture and the stuff, I should say, utensils and cups and stuff like that that were taken from the temple that his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar brought back to Babylon, and decided he's going to throw a party with that, a drunken party. And Daniel reminds him of what happened to his grandfather. That is that he lived for 7 years as a wild animal. And Belshazzar did not learn from that. And so his kingdom will come to an end that night. Daniel tells him this just before he interprets the writing that is on the wall. If you remember that all of a sudden a hand appeared and wrote on the wall. And Daniel tells him this in 5:22 and 23. "Yet you, his son," and he's called son, doesn't mean he's actually the son, but oftentimes it could be a descendant. So his grandson, "Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this." What I just told you about, that he told him about what happened. You know what happened to your grandfather. "But you've exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your nobles, your wives, your concubines have been drinking wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, hear, or understand. But the God in whose hand are your life and breath and all your ways, you have not glorified." See, God allows freedom to make decisions, but God is the one that allows those to be decisions to be, I should say, the outcome. Whether that we think positively, that here I plan this and then it happens. But when we sin, and as Belshazzar finds out, you don't get to choose the consequences. And that's what I remind my children. That you choose to disobey, but you do not get to choose you don't get to choose the consequences of what happens. Belshazzar decides to exalt himself against the God over all. Being there around his grandfather, who was humbled and admitted who is God and God alone. But he didn't learn that. He didn't get to choose the outcome of what happens to pride. No, that night he dies. That night his kingdom is gone from him. It is God who's in control. God is the one that reigns over all. Look at Proverbs 16:1. The plans of the heart belong to man, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. You know, that it's God that, as I said, gives man freedom to make plans and even to think about what to say. But it's God who is the one who will make the decisions whether your plans or anyone's plans will come to fruition. It is God who will be the one who will allow even the words that you speak to come to your lips. God can and has overruled man's lips and what he has planned to say. This doesn't make God responsible for words and plans that are evil. Man is still responsible for sin. And this makes you still responsible for your sin, whether words or actions or plans. Because God allows the freedom, and God is the one that chooses what will happen. God's the one that chooses the consequences of sinful choices. And also even things that he might say that are good. I mean, things that we would say that are good, but God has better plans. God gets the right to choose what happens. We can make, and so we trust ourselves to the Lord. But it's God who reigns and rules. He's the one that establishes. He's the one that, even if a plan is allowed to go on for a time, he's the one that can decide that it's time to end. We don't even get to decide how long our plans will last. And so he's in control of all those details. You know, Proverbs 16:9. The mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. Proverbs 19:21. Many plans are in a man's heart, but the counsel of the Lord will stand. And so whether you are a Christian or unbeliever, nothing can happen unless it is God who allows it. So God is in control. Man is not a robot that just goes around mindlessly. God allows freedom to make the decisions. He allows freedom in this area as long as it's something He has not said directly that you must do or not do. He allows freedom. And so He's the one that allows these plans to come to pass. Now, if we come to this area and disobey Him by not doing what we're supposed to doing or doing what we're not supposed to be doing, He chooses the consequences. He's the one that's in control. Proverbs 21:1, the king's heart is like channels of water in the hands of the Lord. He turns it wherever He wishes. This is God who is in control. You know, I think of as well that here when it was time for Israel to come back from Babylon, they needed to rebuild the temple. They needed money to do it. You know who's the one that paid for it? The very ones that took over the empire of who conquered Israel. The Mede and Persian Empire paid for that because God's in control. God's the one that directed, as He said, 70 years. He directed it's time for them to go back. God's in control. Job 23:13-14. But He is unique. Speaking of God, who could turn Him? And what His soul desires that He does, for He performs what is appointed for me, and many such decrees are with Him. What Job is talking about of that God is unique, and He does, is that unlike a king who has counselors, a king or even our president who surrounds him with people that a king or our president makes decisions based on what other people tell them. He may have an idea of what he wants to do, but then he hears from others and decides, okay, well, you know what they're saying is better than what I'm thinking. And so they persuade him not to do what he was going to do. Well, God is not like that. He doesn't need any counselors to persuade him not to do something. He already knows it all. Psalm 33:11, the counsel of the Lord stands forever, the plans of His heart from generation to generation. It's God's plans that stand forever, not man's. Even if God allows our plans to go for a time, ours do not stand forever. Even if man makes plans that are wicked and evil, they don't stand forever. They do not. We see that time and time again throughout history. wicked man decided to destroy God's people, whether that is beginning with Israel and then believers, their plans did not go forever, but for a time. It's happened over and over, and God has overruled them. Isaiah 46, 9 through 10. Remember the former things long past, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things which have not been done, saying, my purpose will be established, and I will accomplish all my good pleasure. So let it be established that it is God who establishes plans. God can give man freedom to make decisions, but God's the one that has the final say. He even has the final say when man sins. That I will choose the consequences for your disobedience. Man cannot do that. And God will also, even in sin, God, He can use that for different purposes. As we'll see in different messages, He has different plans. But man may think he can do something forever, but he does not. It is God who's in control. Here are some examples of God overruling man's plans. After the flood, God told mankind to be fruitful and multiply and fill the whole earth. He told that to Noah and his family. Well, after a couple generations, mankind decided to disobey God and to live in one area and build a tower, which you know is the Tower of Babel. They made all these plans that here, let us be one people. Let us build this great tower. Let's make a name for ourselves. Directly disobeying God. But here, God is the one that's in control. Genesis 11, 1 through 4. Now the whole earth used the same language and the same words that came about as they sojourned east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. And they said, come, let us build for ourselves a city, and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name. Otherwise we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. Directly defying God. But God had the final say-so. Genesis 11, 6 through 8, the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language, and this is what they begin to do. And now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down, and there confuse our language, so they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the whole face of the earth, and they stopped building the city. You want to know where languages come from? It comes from here, that God confused the languages. Joseph, think about Joseph as well. Not only did God overrule the plans of the Tower of Babel, but he also did in what was going to happen to Joseph. Because remember Joseph, his brothers were jealous of him. The oldest 10, we would say. They saw the special treatment that Jacob did, who gave him a coat with the multi-colors that showed that he was really saying special, that he had the rights of the firstborn, even though he's the 11th oldest. They were jealous of Jacob's treatment. They were also jealous of the dreams that God gave to Joseph, in which that signified that Joseph would be the ruler of the family. They thought it meant that he had the rights of in a sense, of the firstborn, would be the leader of the family after Jacob died. But that's not the plans that God had. And so they planned to kill Joseph. But God changed their minds. So they threw him in a pit, and then they sold him. And they meant that for evil. but God meant that for good. God used that to keep this family alive. Because look at this. As for you in Genesis 50:20, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result to preserve many people alive. God sent Joseph 20 years ahead, 20 years before the famine, to keep this family alive and through whom the Messiah would come. God is in control of all things. He overruled the brothers' plans. Balak, who was a king, who hated the Israelites, who saw them as enemies, sought to hire Balaam to curse the people of Israel while they're in the wilderness. 3 times he tried to have him curse the people of Israel, and each time God overruled what Balaam said and turned what was intended to be a curse into a blessing of his people. Numbers 23, verse 5, Then the Lord put a word in Balaam's mouth and said, Return to Balak, and you shall speak thus. Verses 8 through 12 says, here's what Balaam is saying. How shall I curse whom God has not cursed? And how can I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced? As I see him from the top of the rocks, and I look at him from the hills, behold, a people who dwells apart and will not be reckoned among the nations. Who can count the dust of Jacob, or number the 4th part of Israel? Let me die the death of the upright, and let my end be like his. Then Balak said to Balaam, What have you done to me? I took you to curse my enemies, but behold, you have actually blessed them. He said, Must I not be careful to speak what the Lord puts in my mouth? And this happened 2 more times, a total of 3. Even though Balak promised all the silver and gold, God overruled that. And then he could not do anything other than what God allowed. I think of as well, in the book of Esther, Haman devised a wicked plan because he hated Mordecai, who was a Jew. He had plans to kill Mordecai, but that wasn't enough. He decided to wipe out the entire nation of Jews, Israel. Not just those who are living in the city, in the capital city, but those who lived in the entire empire. He wanted all of them dead. And so he bribed the king with money that a year from now, that everyone should kill the Jews. Well, God had other plans in mind. We know, when you're familiar with that, you know what happened. God overruled that. Haman had built a gallows to hang Mordecai upon, but was instead hanged upon that and executed. When it was found out that Esther, out of all the women in the province, in the kingdom of Persia, become queen. It turned out that she revealed herself that she was a Jew, and it was her people who Haman was planning to kill, which meant the queen would be dying as well. Well, the king would have none of that. Look at, as well, Esther 7, 9 through 10. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs who were before the king, said, Behold, indeed, the gallows standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high. 50 cubits high is about 75 feet high. That's a large gallows, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the behalf of the king. It's actually Mordecai who saved the king's life. And the king said, Hang him on it. And so they hanged Haman on the gallows which he prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. But because the laws of the Medes and the Persians could not be altered, they had to send out a new decree, one that people could choose to obey, or obey the original, or obey the new one, which actually allowed for the Jews to defend themselves, the new one. Instead of the Jews being killed, God overruled, and those who devised evil were killed. Esther 9:1. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, when the king's command and edict were about to be executed, on the day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain mastery over them, it was turned to the contrary, so the Jews themselves gained the mastery over those who hated them. God is in control. Jonah was commanded by God to go to Nineveh and deliver a message to these people that they repent. Well, Jonah instead decided he was going to board a ship and flee to what is most likely modern-day Spain. But God overruled those plans. He sent a storm that made those people fearful. And they were superstitious, calling upon their false gods who would not answer. And so Jonah revealed himself that the storm was because of him. And if they throw him overboard, they would be safe. And so God in sovereignty sent the storm, and then we know that God sent the whale as well, or the great fish. In Jonah 1:17, and the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the stomach of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Luke 12:16 through 21 is this parable that Jesus speaks of, that those who are rich in this world, a warning as those verses being rich towards God, salvation. When you put your hope and trust and all you're living for is money. But this also shows that God's sovereignty in this as well. Because look at this. And he told them a parable, saying, the land of a rich man was very productive. And he began reasoning to himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops? And he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. This guy makes plans. But God said to him, you fool, that very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. It's a warning about seeking after things of this world and not God's. But it also shows his sovereignty, because God is the one that established the beginning and the end of our lives. We make plans, but we may not be here tomorrow to see those plans continue on. I think about as well, what about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace? God preserved them. What about Daniel, who was thrown in the lion's den? He was spared his life. What about when King Herod wanted to kill the Messiah? God overruled that, warned Joseph in a dream to flee to Egypt. What about also Herod's son, Herod, because he had a son named Herod as well, was allowed to kill the apostle James, and saw that it pleased the Jews, decided, I'm going to kill Peter. Remember that? God sent an angel and led Peter out and released him from prison. What about when the religious Jewish leaders tried to stop the apostles from preaching the gospel and threw them in the jail? The Lord released them as well from jail. God overruled that. It is said that Rome tried to kill the apostle John by dipping him into boiling oil, but failed, and he lived. And so he was sent to the Isle of Patmos. So who is really in control? God or man? It's God. Man has the freedom to make plans, but God's the one that sees them, whether they will fail or be successful. He's the one that chooses the consequence of our actions. He has the final say. Nothing is allowed to be done apart from his will. And so praise the Lord that he's sovereign. Thank God, who is good, that he is sovereign rather than wicked men. Thank God that wicked man is not beyond his sovereignty, or we'd be in trouble. So he is in control. And so how to respond to his sovereignty? Take comfort that God is sovereign. Why take comfort? Because he overrules man's plans. We'd be in trouble if there were those who were beyond God's control and sovereignty. But he is the one who allows man's plans to come to pass. He is the one that chooses the consequences. He's the one that chooses whether successful or not, and allows things to happen for different reasons. And so first here, so when men do evil to you, God has allowed that, and he overrules what is intended to harm you, to actually mature you into Christ's likeness. What man may choose to do, and that God's allowed, God overrules the intentions and what happens. Man intends it for evil, just as even as Joseph said to his brothers, you intended this for evil, but God intended this for what? Good. He uses this to actually mature you as into Christ's likeness. Romans 8, 28 through 30. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good, to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brethren. And these whom he predestined, he also called. And these whom he called, he also justified. And these whom he justified, he also, what? Glorified. Your plans, I should say, let me back up before I go on to the next point. Thank God that God only allows what is best in my life, even though that is painful and meant by evil by people, terrible things. And I can speak from experience of evil things that people have done. Some things were unintentional. Others were. But yet God only allowed that for my good. He only allows it for your good to mature into Christ's likeness. And so we can praise God, we can trust him, we thank him for that. Also, your plans will not come to pass in the Lord unless the Lord allows that. So trust God. You pray to him, and you trust that this will be established. And if it's not established, you still trust him. And so make wise decisions. Because even though God gives you freedom in many areas where he said that this is not sin, or where he directly said this is what you are to do, or he prohibits something because it's sinful, your plans will either fail or come to pass. As I said, if they fail, it's because that was for your good. Because it wasn't what was, we thought it was good, but that wasn't what was best. And thank him that he knows what is best, that God is always good. He is in control. He is wise. He's all-knowing. He's all-powerful. All of his attributes we talked about, they all work together at the same time. It is who he is. He's not sovereign sometimes and not the other. So thank him. If they fail, it is because it's for your good. If they're successful, that's for your good as well. And sometimes it's because, sometimes we need to learn lessons as well. And there's many reasons for why God does what he does. But we just trust him. Day by day, trusting him. That is Proverbs 3, verse 5 and 6. Trust the Lord with all your heart and lean not into your own understanding. That he will, it speaks of that he will make your paths straight. Let me actually read that. I'll read for you Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 there. As I think about his wisdom and trusting God and just being faithful to the Lord, that he knows always what is best. He is good. and always good and only good. There is none like him. Trust the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. And here's what I forgot as I was trying to quote that. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. But verse 7 also says, do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. Trust the Lord day by day. Response. Here that we must remind ourselves those things. And then also, God's the one who establishes leadership and authority. Those in any position, whether it's government or whether at churches, at home, the police, the list go on. Anyone who's in authority, is God has established them. And I think what I really want to focus on is our president. God put, whether you like it or not, God put Trump as president, and so you ought to pray for him, be respectful even when you disagree with our leadership. We are still to be respectful and pray that they would turn from their evil. And if Hillary was elected president, you would need to do the same. Pray for our leaders. Romans 13 through 1 through 2, Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who are opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. And so God is sovereign over that. He's sovereign over our leaders. Nobody gets in any position without him allowing that for whatever purpose he has. Nobody pulled a fast one on the Lord. He has established that. And he is in control, and he has his purposes and reasons for doing so. Let's go ahead and pray.